Right, we're now going to be hearing from Adobe, talking a little bit more about design, creativity, some of the popular tools within AI, but also how can we improve trust, transparency, and authenticity in the era of AI. Please welcome Laura Herman.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out bright and early this morning amidst all the rain. So glad to see so many smiling faces. So I'm going to be talking today about how artificial intelligence is changing creativity. I know it's a very common topic these days, but hopefully I'll give you some new and interesting tidbits. All right, so we all know that artificial intelligence is changing humans' creative practices, but many technologies and tools have done that before. I want to be sure to call out today Better Images of AI. This is an initiative some of you may have heard about. They're really trying to challenge the way that we're representing AI in our sort of public visual discourse, because we know it's very important how we visualize things, right? So definitely recommend checking them out. You'll see a couple of their images throughout my presentation today. All right, so let's take a few steps back and think about Instagram. So some of you may remember the good old days when Instagram would actually show you images from the people that you followed in the order that those people posted those images. Seems like a distant past now. First, Instagram changed the order of the images, sort of rejiggering your feed according to what it assumes that you'll engage with. And then it started showing you images and videos from people that you didn't even choose to follow. So importantly, these decisions about which images and videos to show you on Instagram are all being made by AI as well. So we talk a lot about generative AI, but I want to think as well about these algorithmic recommendation systems. And in 2023 alone, Instagram doubled the amount of algorithmically recommended content in your feed, as you can see in this press release here. So all of this leads to platforms like Instagram, TikTok, Pinterest, becoming these sort of cultural curators. Right now, they are the primary places where we engage with creative content, right? They're where creative trends proliferate. They're where people learn how to use new creative tools. They're where creators are discovered, and ultimately where many creators are making a living today. So as these AI systems are determining who sees what when, they're playing this sort of cultural gatekeeper role, right? So they're determining what becomes visible in our culture, and this has huge effects on society. So as we think about these AI systems determining who sees what when, sort of begs the question, well, what is the algorithm's taste? What criteria does it use to choose which images to show us when? Well, as many of you know, we don't have an answer to that. We don't get an answer because these algorithms are shrouded in mystery, right? They exist in these things that researchers call black boxes. So for instance, Instagram's parent company, Meta, makes sure that no one can know exactly how Instagram's algorithm is working, right? And even people on the inside sometimes don't know why these algorithmic systems are choosing for certain images to be displayed. I'm sure we've all heard examples of some of the very engineers who built these algorithmic systems saying, I have no idea why it's choosing this image or video to come up on your feed. So I think this question of what influences machines' ways of seeing is extremely important and possibly the sort of question of our generation right now. And that is because machines will be not only the primary viewers of creative content going forward, but they're also going to determine who and what becomes visible to the public. So I was particularly interested in sort of prompting some of these questions to the public and examining, comparing humans and algorithms' ways of seeing. So I put on an exhibit in London last year. It was called the Algorithmic Pedestal. And the idea was to sort of evoke, some of you may be familiar with Marcel Duchamp's artwork in which he put basically a urinal on display. And by putting it on display in a gallery, he said, it is now an artwork, right? So what algorithms or humans put on display determines sort of what people see and therefore shapes cultural tastes. So in the context of this exhibit, I took hundreds and hundreds of images from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's open access collection. They basically represent the entire canon of art history, right? They have tons and tons of images available online for researchers to use. And I gave those images to a human curator, an artist named Fabienne Hess, who's based in London. And then I also took those images and gave them to Instagram itself. So what I did is I created this new Instagram account called the Algorithmic Pedestal, and I just uploaded as many images as I could without getting blocked by the algorithmic system. And then I went to the sort of home feed of a couple of different accounts following that account and saw which images Instagram chose to display in which order. And it turns out Instagram always chose the exact same images in the exact same order. So something about those particular images from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection that Instagram wanted the public to see. And that starts to reveal some of its sort of ways of seeing. Now, in the context of the exhibit, we put Fabienne's sort of human curation on one side of the exhibit and Instagram's algorithmic curation on the other side of the exhibit. And the idea was to sort of prompt the public to think about how these different curatorial entities choose what to display to us. This was recast by the press as a sort of competition between algorithms and humans. That wasn't really our intention. The goal was really just to get all of the visitors to the exhibit to start thinking about, how are algorithms influencing what I see? And how is what I see influencing my sort of cultural reality, my visual ecology, so to speak? Now, in the context of the exhibit, we got to bring the public into contact with these research questions and ask the visitors what differences they noticed between the algorithmic curation and the human curation. Now, you can see a little bit of a sneak peek of the algorithmic side of the exhibit here. And interestingly, what we saw when we talked to the exhibit visitors, what did they notice about what the algorithm was choosing? Well, a lot of that may be not particularly surprising to an audience of marketeers, but we saw that Instagram was choosing easily recognizable objects above all else, something that it could confidently deduce what it's looking at using its computer vision systems. We also saw a prevalence of images that were very quick to view, images that you could take in very rapidly and didn't need to spend too much time looking at. We saw a prevalence of faces. I think there's a sort of well-known algorithmic hack that if you just put an image of a face or make sure there's a face in the image somewhere, it will rise to the top of people's feeds. And sure enough, Instagram was choosing a lot of images with faces in them. And then something that was really interesting was that Instagram seemed to choose images in the Met's collection that were sort of reminiscent of like a product shot or a commercial image. So you might be able to see on the front here this couch sort of sofa that's a blue and white brocade sofa. Now, that is an example of a piece of art that the Met has in its collection in its sort of furniture division. But Instagram may have misinterpreted that sofa as for sale, right? For sale, possibly even on Instagram shops. And this was right around the time where Instagram was really pushing Instagram shops. So it is possible that they actually tweaked their algorithm to look out for product shot-looking images and promote those in people's feeds. Now, on the other side of the exhibit, which you don't see here, we had Fabienne's human curation. Now, on the human curation side, there was a huge focus on sort of materiality, conceptuality, emotionality. There's all these very human considerations that the machine was completely missing, right? So when we first asked Fabienne to do the curation, she said, well, what's the concept of this exhibit? What should it be the organizing principle for my curation? I said, well, Fabienne, that's a very human question of you to ask. Instagram didn't ask us that. Choose whatever concept you'd like. So she decided to choose the concept of loss. Now, loss is a very human concept in her view, something that a machine could never fully understand. So her side of the exhibit was all about this very human, emotional sort of concept. Now, you could make the argument that Instagram's curation is organized according to the concept of profit, and then we have this really nice sort of dichotomy comparing profit and loss on the two sides of the exhibit. The last thing I want to say about this exhibit is that we were able to bring artists into the context of the exhibit to ask them some questions about how AI is influencing what they create. Now, this wasn't about generative AI influencing what they create, but about algorithmic curation influencing what they create. So sure enough, when we were talking to artists, they said, yes, the works that they see on Instagram often inspire them. Just like how people might look at Pinterest and get an idea for a project, they see what's coming up on Instagram and that inspires their work. Now, even more directly, the works that come up on their feed shape their view of what the art world is today. So they get a sense of what's trending in the art world, and they might start making works accordingly. They also, and what was most interesting to me, is that they also found themselves making certain pieces that they thought would perform well on Instagram. So you can imagine an artist making more portraits because faces are going to show up more and more on their sort of audience's feeds than a still life. So there were some really interesting conversations to be had about how algorithmic curation is impacting artists. So Instagram as a whole, and particularly its underlying AI system, are shaping what creators make. So this creates an interesting little feedback loop where the algorithmic platforms acting as curators and cultural gatekeepers shape the creative content that humans make. And then this content, as we all know, is used to train the algorithmic platforms. So we have this cycle where algorithmic platforms impact the human artists and the human artist output impact the algorithmic platforms. But now, of course, there's a whole other layer to this cycle because AI systems are creating themselves. And I think this is a version of actually the same chart that Chris showed earlier. Basically, there's a new class of AI called generative AI. We're all sick and tired of hearing about it these days. But it is actually creating content itself, right? And this has made AI's influence on creativity even more obvious. And if nothing else, I'm very glad that it's brought these questions of AI and creativity into the public domain. So there has been a ton of debate about how generative AI is influencing sort of work and creativity. We've already had some of that very debate at this conference. There's the question of, oh, is AI sort of the harbinger of all human creativity, or is it a newfound creative frontier that will unlock completely new forms of expression? My personal view is a little bit more nuanced than either of those extremes. I think that generative AI is not the beginning, nor is it the end. It is a new tool in the creative's toolbox, right? So this new tool, as any new tool does, changes the role of the creator. So that change in the creator's role changes the creative process, and I want to focus on those changes to the creative process now. So first, what I have here is the sort of old linear creative process. This is all something that we probably learned back in primary school. Like you start out with sort of inspiration, gathering inspiration images, and then gradually you go through, you plod along the creative process, you produce the thing magically, and then you share it out in some way, you publish it, right? But this moment of production that I've highlighted in the center here, this is where there's an opportunity for automation. Now, I've had the pleasure of collaborating with an artist named Memo Atkin. Some of you may be familiar with his work. He's a terrific AI artist. And he thinks that this moment of production represents a shift. And he equates this shift to long division. Now, long division is something that many of us probably learned in school, but we don't often do long division ourselves these days. I don't know how many of you sit down and do some long division for fun. Personally, I always reach for my calculator as soon as I need to do any sort of long division. Now, Memo is saying that this is the way that painting and drawing are going. It's something that we all maybe learn in school when we're young, but when it actually comes time to produce the thing at high fidelity, we'll reach for our devices. I want to be very clear, though, that the human creator is still integral to creativity, just as Chris was saying. Even generative tools, like you can see here, seem to know this. When I just put creator into Adobe Firefly, this is what it gave me. This is what an artist looks like to it. So it's the role of that human creator that's changing rather than the creator disappearing in any way. So the parts of the creative process that human is performing are different. So on this slide here, I've outlined the new creative process in the age of generative AI. This comes from dozens and dozens of studies by my team at Adobe, and I won't have time to go through all of the changes to the creative process here, but I want to call out a few pieces that might be particularly interesting. You'll notice that terms like ideation and iteration are replaced with things like direction and curation. And this is because generative AI produces ideas in high fidelity right from the start. So it's up to the human to direct and select amongst those ideas. In particular, these areas in pink are what the human creator is focused on in this new creative process. They're focused on coming up with ideas, and they're focusing on deciding amongst an array of options. Now, just to get a little bit into the weeds of how this works without getting too technical, essentially generative AI produces a latent space of possible images or videos. And the creator is basically directing that system. So they're aiming a lens at a certain subsection of that latent space by prompting the system. Currently, that prompting is often done through words, but you could imagine in the future different forms of prompting. All of this is basically direction, right? It's very similar to the idea of sort of aiming a camera lens at one thing and taking that photo. Now, the machine then surfaces a subset of images according to where that lens has been directed and basically gets a response to that prompt, right? You have a few images or videos that it produces. Now, the human, again, is responsible for choosing among those options. So this is that selection component I mentioned before. And then ultimately, it's the human that directs how, when, and where those selected images are displayed. So all of this together, I would call curation. Now, we humans are very good curators. We like to select from given options. It's much harder to spontaneously produce a beautiful piece of music than it is to pick out which piece of music is beautiful, right? So we have a taste. And this taste, this human sort of discernment, is something that I believe is far too subjective for a variable-based mathematical system like an AI to have. So looking to the future, I think the creative skills that we need to focus on are the curatorial skills. We're seeing curation move earlier and earlier in the creative process so that artists become curators. And our human discernment, our taste, becomes the most sought after creative skill of all. So at Adobe, my team is responsible for making sure that we support and uplift human creativity at all stages of product development. So for instance, we worked on Adobe Firefly's commercially safe model that is trained only on images for which the creators have been properly compensated. We also worked on Adobe Photoshop's generative fill feature, which some of you may be familiar with, and that really enables creative professionals to use generative technology in the context of their existing workflows rather than replacing their workflow altogether. We also work on the Content Authenticity Initiative, which transparently labels content as AI generated. I want to dig into the Content Authenticity Initiative a little bit more because it seems like there's a lot of interest in this audience around authenticity and generative AI. Now, so far, I have been talking about artists' discernment and sort of taste from a very artistic perspective. But what about discernment on behalf of the people consuming these sort of creative content? The people that are consuming media in today's ecosystem, aka all of us, really are looking for signals about which pieces of content to trust when. Which content is authentic, particularly when we think about the rise of misinformation and deepfakes. I think many of us are familiar with these two famous examples. We've been seeing images like these generated by AI flooding our sort of media landscape, and they're simultaneously highly convincing and highly misleading. So we wanted to support people in making their trust decisions about images like these. And so Adobe started what we call the Content Authenticity Initiative. Now, this initiative was actually started back in 2019, way before all of the generative AI hype. But Adobe has long made very powerful software that is generally used for creative and constructive purposes, but sometimes falls into the hands of bad actors and may be used to sort of manipulate or mislead folks. So we felt very strongly that we should have a responsibility to try and address these issues. So the Content Authenticity Initiative from the get-go has been an open source initiative. So all of the underlying technology I'm about to talk about is available online for anybody and everybody to use, including our own business competitors. So just want to call that out. And the Content Authenticity Initiative is a group of members, currently over 2,700 members, actually. And that includes major media companies, both news agencies as well as more consumer-facing organizations, but also technology partners on both the hardware and software side of things. So when we think about this sort of transparency and authenticity landscape, there's 4 important pillars that people tend to focus on. And the first is detection. Now, many people think that detection is the sort of ultimate solution to mis and disinformation. But the way that detection technology works is essentially that it uploads an image or a video to a program that looks for telltale signs of manipulation. And this could be things like inconsistent pixel structures or just a sloppy photoshopping job. Now, detection software can be very useful on an ad hoc basis when you have the time and bandwidth to upload each of these individual images to the program. However, it's unfortunately not very scalable. It takes quite a while to run images through detection software, and it's often not particularly accurate. And it's particularly not accurate in the context of social media because in order for this detection software to work, it needs a pretty large version of the file. It needs a high resolution version of the file. And as soon as we upload something to social media, it gets compressed down. So then the detection software won't work as well in social media contexts, which is where a lot of the sort of misinformation mischief is happening today. The third really important component of why detection isn't the sort of end-all be-all solution is that it is really going to create a sort of arms race. As soon as detection software improves, bad actors are going to come up with better and better ways to sort of fool that detection software. So we get in this sort of endless vicious cycle. So detection software can definitely be useful, but at the Content Authenticity Initiative, we don't think that it is the only solution. And so we're focused on 3 other pillars that I want to briefly talk about. Firstly, policy. It's really important for us to interact with lawmakers and policymakers to make sure that everyone is aware of sort of the latest technology, both what's here now and what's coming around the corner. And in terms of authenticity, what we're hearing sort of directionally from policymakers here in the EU, as well as in the UK and in the US, is that there's an interest in mandating transparency as it relates to artificial intelligence. So it may be possible that this sort of authenticity component is actually something that's driven by policy. Now, in terms of, the next pillar here is education. Now, if we want to fight misinformation and disinformation, there needs to be a component of public awareness. So we're focused on media literacy, which is a huge part of empowering the public, all of us, to make informed decisions about what to trust when. And the last pillar I want to talk about is really the focus of the Content Authenticity Initiative, and that is provenance. And when I say provenance, I'm referring to the basic trustworthy facts about the origins of a digital file. So this could be, where did this file come from? How has this file been manipulated on its journey from creation through to editing, through to publishing? And how can we share that information directly with the viewer of this digital file? So here we have sort of a quick definition of provenance. It's all about essentially proving what's real rather than detecting what's fake. So sort of this inversion of the detection mechanisms I was discussing earlier. Now, the Content Authenticity Initiative has mostly been focused on creators, news media, and generative AI to date, but there's so many use cases of this technology, including brand reputation, e-commerce, insurance, auditing, law enforcement. The list just goes on and on and on. Now, for election integrity and politics, this is a particularly important sort of use case for considering authenticity. As many of you know, over 2 billion people in the world this year will vote in 50 elections across the globe. And we're already seeing the generative AI being used to manipulate campaign imagery. So the urgency to implement provenance technologies has really never been more clear to us. Now, in terms of how this technology actually works, I wanted to go through sort of the basic steps with you all. The first step is capture. So this is when the sort of digital content is first being captured, right? And we're working with smartphone manufacturers, we're working with camera manufacturers to make sure that there's transparent provenance information baked in from the very start of the content's journey. Now, the next step is editing. Obviously, we're working on integrating this technology into Adobe's tools, but as this is an open source initiative, we would love for these tools to be in all editing software so that whenever anyone makes an edit to an image anywhere, let's say you darken the image, you change the tone, you crop it, you remove an object, all of that information is securely stored with the image itself, sort of as a sort of digital chain of custody that goes with the image wherever it may land. Now, the next step here is publishing, and that's in terms of the content actually landing somewhere. We're working very closely with publishers and CMS manufacturers to make sure that the metadata fields in which we're storing this sort of provenance information are kept intact. Right now, if I were to send you an email with an image attached, the metadata often gets stripped away. And since we're using metadata as the way to impose transparency, it's really important that the metadata stays intact. So we're working with publishers to make sure that that's the case. Now, lastly, is this final step of trust. And this is making sure that this provenance information is readily available to the viewers of the content, right? So that they have a sense of what they're actually looking at and whether they can trust it. So we do all of this through what we call the content credential. You can see the little icon for content credentials on the screen here. This was a recent design unveiling, so we're very excited about this icon. And the goal is to make this icon ubiquitous everywhere across the media landscape so that it's a symbol for credibility, and if not credibility, then at least for transparency. So that people have a sense when they see this icon, they can get more information about exactly how this content was made, how it was shared, how it was edited, and so forth. Now, I just want to quickly show you here all of the different types of information that can be included in a content credential. There's a ton that you can put in here, all about how a piece of content was created, how it was edited, how it was shared. But there's also some really important situations in which people might not want to share all of this information. You can imagine, for instance, a war journalist in a conflict zone who would certainly not want their GPS location data to be tagged to the image that they capture because it could be literally fatal for them. Similarly, you could imagine a sort of human rights campaigner under a dictatorial regime. They wouldn't want their name or identity to be tagged to that piece of content. So for that reason, all of the information stored in content credentials will be customizable. So the user will have the power to decide what is disclosed when. Now, obviously, all of this begs the question, well, what about AI? That's what we've been talking about already today. And of course, Adobe has our own generative AI tools. I mentioned Adobe Firefly earlier. And I'm really excited to share that every single file downloaded from Adobe Firefly automatically has content credentials built into it. So if you are to click on an image made in Adobe Firefly, you can see some information about exactly how it was made, what models were used, for instance. We refer to this basically as a digital nutrition label. So just as you might go to a supermarket and see some information on the back of a package about what's inside of the food you're picking up, you can look at this and get a sense of what's inside the image and how it was created. Now, we're also working on video. Obviously, that's the next craze in generative AI technology. You can imagine this is a politician speaking to some journalists, and suddenly it goes red, right? Something has changed. Now, if you want to have some more information about why that went red, you can click on the content credential here, and you get a sense of what exactly happened and how that video was manipulated. Now, in addition to the Content Authenticity Initiative, we've also created a global standards organization because really what we're trying to do is create global standards. So together with a lot of these other companies listed here, we've created something that we call the C2PA, or the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. Now, that's a long name, so that's why we go with C2PA. The idea is that this C2PA standard, which sits within the Linux Foundation, many of you may know them as the sort of preeminent open source initiative across the globe, provides the technical specifications or the blueprint for authenticity. So we've already released the sort of C2PA specification back in 2022. It's constantly being updated in the age of generative AI. But essentially, this is a blueprint for anyone who wants to work on transparency and authenticity to take these specifications and use them possibly together with CAI's open source tooling. So very recently, this is hot off the press, Meta, Google, and OpenAI have all announced that they are implementing the C2PA standard. So this means that we will have sort of industry-wide generative AI sort of capturing information to improve transparency and authenticity. So one way to think about this is that C2PA is the sort of architect, while CAI is the construction company. I wanted to show you a little demo of how this might work if you imagine bringing an image from Photoshop through to a social media feed. So here we start. We have an image that we're in Photoshop with, and we can see that Content Credentials is enabled. You can see a little CR logo because the image already has a content credential from Adobe Stock. Now, let's say I want to go and manipulate this image a little bit. I decide to cool down the tonality, and then I also bring in these artificial clouds. I then even can bring in an image from my device and throw in some snow there. And suddenly we're starting to get these snowy pyramids. Now, when we export these snowy pyramids, we can see all the content credential information there, and we might share it to a social media site, as I mentioned, something like Instagram, for example. Now, when I see these snowy pyramids on my social media feed, I can click on the content credential and inspect that content credential to learn more. And I see the whole family tree of the image. And I can even go in and sort of compare the initial state of the image and then ultimately how it was edited. Now, all of this technology is actually available today, and we're working with social media platforms to make sure that all of this becomes visible to the public. All right, so very briefly, 3 key areas of focus for us. One is the open standards. This is being done by the C2PA. And then we also have sort of the implementation of that standard and member collaboration being done by the Content Authenticity Initiative, along with education and advocacy, because that's a really important part of this transparency journey. Now, I just thought I would put this QR code up here in case any of you are interested in joining the Content Authenticity Initiative. It is open to organizations, but also to individuals, and actually over half of our 2,000 members are individuals who are just concerned and want to be involved in this changing media landscape for the better. So with that, I will wrap up my talk with a couple of high-level provocations that I'm hoping you all will consider throughout the rest of your day today and possibly throughout the rest of your week. First, I want you to think about how you would describe your taste to a machine. I mean, better yet, just think about how you describe your taste to another human. We don't often think about having control over what it is that we want to see. How do you currently decide which creations you see today? And what would art made for a machine curator look like, and how would that be different from art made for a human curator? Now, what would you make if you didn't have to generate it from scratch? If you didn't have to paint or draw and you could just create anything, what would that be? And when we think about these technologies, who is empowered by these new forms of creativity and who needs to be protected? And last but not least, how can we together make informed decisions about what to trust in the age of generative AI? So if you have any answers to those questions or questions yourself, do feel free to get in touch. Thank you so much for listening today. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.